everyone, and welcome to the next instalment of our Audit Committee in the Chair series. My name is Maria Diver and I'm part of the Audit Committee Institute in Ireland, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Deirdre Somers, Audit Committee Chair and Non-Executive Director. Deirdre, firstly, thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Maybe to get started, in terms of that transition from an executive role into a non-exec role and into an Audit Committee Chair, I suppose what for you are the key enablers of managing that transition and the key success factors to a smooth process?
So I think the first is to get into, and it sounds fairly basic, the first is to get into a mindset that this is a tough and difficult job. When you think about it, the job of a board is ridiculously complex. It presides over the delivery of a strategy and a business model to the expectation of multiple stakeholders, investors, regulators, management, staff, external, and in a constantly changing economic regulatory environment with media and public scrutiny. So when you take all of those elements together, what you then impose is a bunch of very different people from completely different backgrounds who don't really know one another profoundly, don't have the benefit of years and years of experience within the organisation. And you expect cohesion, decisiveness, commitment, knowledge, responsibility, and that's only the start. So I think the first and very basic thing to understand is that this is going to be challenging. And the idea that if you have had a challenging executive job, that immediately morphs into effectiveness on a board is a fairly innocent place to start. So getting your own mindset right, I think, is the first and most important success factor. Understanding that your role is completely differentiated from an executive role, and you need to give that new role the humility and respect it deserves. And that may seem fairly basic, but I hear a lot of people who transition from very high-octane executive roles saying, well, this will be easy. And it's not easy. It may be not as time-consuming or as time-critical as an executive role, but it is certainly not easy. The second success factor is knowing that you're in an area of constant learning. And that is not just technical, which is to some extent the easiest piece of it, because most boards are very well structured for teaching their directors, for director education, for director training, and a lot of regulation requires that. The more difficult constant learning is a more personal learning, which is how can I be effective? How am I impacting? Has my expectations or objectives going into this board meeting being met? Why was I not as effective as I want to have been? And that type of self-analysis and self-criticism, I think, is really important at the early stages of being a non-executive director. It's very easy to be very right, but very ineffective in a director role. And particularly when you come from a very technical environment where what is right technically is usually what is right. In most board situations, what is right is only half the job. Getting people to understand it's what's right is the other half of the job. The third critical success factor is to understand your own value to the board, what it is that the chairman and the board are looking for from you and where you can deliver greatest value.
And I think there's really good points there around, getting that balance between, not being too intrusive and allowing a real, a proper functioning audit committee to take place. And if you think of the last couple of years, right, and you mentioned change and uncertainty and a lot of things came together at the kind of in the same time in the last couple of years. And how do you balance that from an audit committee perspective, being dynamic, being agile to respond, but also ensuring that governance prevails in the end?
Well, I think it's really important to get the agenda right. It may seem fairly basic, but the agenda for the Audit Committee is fairly fundamental, and to make sure that it is not set in aspic, you know. And I think some Audit Committee governance can become very routine. There are certain tasks to be done. Those tasks can be plotted throughout the year. It's very clear what those tasks are. But then, in advance of every committee, you need to sit down with the team to say, well, what are the other issues that we need to discuss at the Audit Committee, and get that agenda correctly balanced between the routine expectations of an Audit Committee around the interims, the annuals, the et ceteras, and then how have we really performed this year? How has the finance function performed? How is it delivered to the strategy? Are there new changes in the environment? And ESG is a fairly fundamental one now that we need to embrace and bring into our work plan, so that we are properly preparing for changes before they come, and we are ready to deliver to those changes when they do come.
Yeah. And maybe to pick up on the ESG point, I suppose maybe what's your view? And I know there'll be conflicting views out there in terms of, you know, the Audit Committee's role in that aspect of it versus the role of any, if there's a separate sustainability committee, or, you know, how do you think they should align or come together?
Well, my view is that it's absolutely critical that they align, and I can't really see a circumstance in which you could allow for non-alignment, being frank, particularly as the reporting obligations around ESG are going nowhere but up, and now we have auditor validation of some of the statements within the financial statements. It is important, however, that you don't duplicate. ESG is already a very resource-heavy part of the executive team. If they have an ESG committee, they've already committed a huge amount of resources to that committee, and the one thing that you don't want is that they're having to rock up to the Audit Committee to duplicate the work of the ESG committee. A simple way to deal with that is to ensure that either the chair of the ESG committee, if it exists, or the person who is charged in the board with specific interest in ESG sits on the Audit Committee. And that works very effectively, because that allows then, as chair, for you to put in an ESG component to a lot of the agenda items. Yes. So you can kind of pause at the end and say, is there an ESG component to this? Is there, you know, and how can we see that? Fundamentally, the Audit Committee's job is to give reassurance to the board that the numbers are right and that the statements in the financial statements are right. And to the extent to which those embrace ESG, that role has to evolve to embrace ESG. And therefore, that coming together of those two committees, I think, is inevitable.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, and I think that there's some really valuable points there for people to take away. I think that's all we have time for today, but thanks a lot for your insight and perspective. Thank you all for joining us today, and I look forward to sharing further thoughts and insights with you over the coming months.